I'm singer, songwriter, producer Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 8, Episode 25 of Music is Not a Genre, MxG. Thank you as always for watching and listening. This week's topic, The Great Producers Part 7, the 2010s from a bangarang to a whimper. And yes, as always, thank you for watching and listening. And as I've said many times this season, there's a mid-roll, so please take a listen to it. It's ways you can support this show and the music and all of that. It will be very helpful. It's helpful to all of us indie creators. The only things I'll say right now are like, share, subscribe, rate, review, and tell one person you think is a huge music lover about this show. Those things do more than pretty much anything else, to be honest, that kind of word of mouth. And as far as a music update, I just a couple of weeks ago did that live video album concert solo show for Rec's album Kite to Camden. Well, all the music videos are up, including the video for the full album, but for all 14 songs, single videos for each of those. If you go to youtube.com/@recbandnyc, and that rec is spelled R-E-C in case you don't know, @recbandnyc over at YouTube, you can see all of the videos right now. And by the time this airs, probably will also be posting clips from the live show, so you get to see me in action. That's it, really. I have, new singles out, etc. Just go to nickdimatteo.com/music and you can find out what's going on with that. Let's just get back to the topic now. The Great Producers Part 7, the 2010s, from a bangarang to a whimper. So this is, of course, the 7th in my Great Producers series and is on the 2010s because that's where we are. And by the way, for those of you listening, you're missing the fact that we're hitting a heat wave here in New York City and I'm in a room with no air conditioning. So you get to see me glisten, and not because I'm special. So you, again, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre if you want to see the sweat dripping down the side of my face and what I'm wearing and all that crap. But anyway, back to the topic. I have decided for this series, there's only going to be one more. There will be 8 total episodes on The Great Producers. The next one in a couple of weeks or so, 2, 3, 4 weeks, will be on the 2020s and beyond. And it will be a summary of the entire series as well, since we're only halfway through the 2020s, or more or less. That's about as much of the episode as it will be. And then the other half will be a summary of what I talked about for this entire series. So anyway, the subtitle here, from Bangarang to a Whimper, the decade started out, the 2010s, leaning into EDM and dance rock energy. And by mid-decade, when streaming was huge and beyond, it really morphed into kind of a chill wave, the new definition of lo-fi, that kind of thing, being dominant. And that kind of mellow domination I've talked about on this show a few times, it has continued through to this day, and it's starting to kind of peter out a little bit, especially in the maybe last 2-3 years, but it's still here. And so that is the Bangarang, which of course was a Skrillex song early in the decade, to a whimper, and the whimper is all of the very quiet bedroom pop that everyone believes is somehow more intimate because it's quieter, which is not necessarily true. It's all, some of it's good stuff, but anyway, so I'm going to, of course, talk about all of that. The show format, as with other episodes in this series, I'm going to start with the tech and music changes. They're kind of hand in hand at this point. Then I will do all the great producers in the decade by genre, and I'll have some disclaimers later. I'll get to that. Conclusions, including my favorite producers of the 2010s, the featured song, and the questions, of course, questions for you. And then the bonus MxTRA at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre is called The Death of Genre Bias. I talk about this all the time in one way or another. It's kind of why I started this show, and it's no coincidence that the death of genre bias is related to the 2010s episode, and that this podcast itself started in the 2010s. It started in 2019. So I break down in the bonus how decades of built-in genre bias on both sides of the fence, both for the music creators and the business itself and music fandom, and let's say critics and journalists and stuff, have been fairly quickly erased in the streaming era and the internet era, giving us a wild west of make and like whatever you want, often to the consternation of music-biz people and critics. And I'm going to talk about all that in the bonus MxTRA at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. My sources here are Google and Wikipedia, and that's pretty much it. My own knowledge, let's say. And I do, again, true confession, listen on Spotify and YouTube. So those are some sources as well. Disclaimers, as always, while my producer choices aren't arbitrary, they are incomplete. They're probably biased to a degree. Again, most great producers worked in more than one decade. I try to include them in the decade in which they made the biggest impact, but you'll notice I'll mention some producers from previous decades. I tried to leave out the ones that I believe may have made a bigger impact in the 2020s, but you may hear a couple of those names as well. That's honestly it for the disclaimers. Let's get into the meat, and that is tech and music changes. So the 2010s may ultimately be remembered less for a single dominant musical style. Again, bonus MxTRA at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre is the death of genre bias. And it will be remembered more for a fundamental change in how music was made, distributed, consumed, and discovered. That can be said for just about every decade, but because there weren't any other major, developments tech-wise that were, honestly worth diving into, I really feel like this was the biggest change. And this decade in the 2010s transformed the music business more dramatically than any period since the rise of rock and roll. That is very true. And of course, that change started happening in the 2000s with the internet and downloads and file sharing and all of that, and culminated in the mid-2010s when streaming overtook all other forms of music revenue. So here are some ways in which the tech and music changes happened in this decade. Number one, as I've been talking about here, streaming replaced ownership. This is the biggest change. Most people still bought downloads from iTunes and or found the file. I was still doing file sharing, streaming kind of things like free stuff in the very early 2010s. And in the early 2010s, physical media still mattered. It was... Again, I've said this before, it wasn't the last time I ever bought a CD or received a CD from someone, but I remember making a conscious decision in around 2011, 2012 to stop buying CDs for myself unless there was a special reason, like a collector thing or what have you. Streaming early in the decade was hardly known. Some people did it. It didn't quite get to a point where it was widespread, partly because Spotify wasn't a thing then, and that's really been the dominant, even though Apple is a contender there, and Apple was sort of course, like the first big one, but also because the devices we were using still to that point could not handle that, and the streaming services didn't have everything. I think things were developing still, but by the end of the decade, and honestly, as early as 2015, as early as the middle of the decade, streaming now dominated all music consumption. Playlists became more important than albums. Monthly listeners became like all the metrics, all of the numbers that we worry about as music creators, or if you're in, let's say, the music business, all of that stuff shifted, I should say, from real world physical numbers. How many CDs did you sell at a gig? How much money did you make at a gig? That's still a thing, but not as much as it should be. To what were your streaming numbers? What are your social numbers, etc.? It drives us all crazy, but that's the kind of thing that we started paying attention to about mid-decade, last decade. And of course, that's all it is now, pretty much. Catalog music became easier to access than ever before because of streaming. So the shift became, instead of talking about what albums you own, it's to what did you want to listen to at any given point. It didn't really matter. And of course, that sort of devalued music, and we've talked about that's not what this episode is about, but I've talked about how easy access can devalue things to a degree, and that's certainly true for music. But this from wanting to own music to just wanting to listen to music Seems like it was gradual. It wasn't that gradual. I mean, within the span of less than 5 years, that shifted. 2, hip hop became the center of popular music. Rock had been the dominant cultural force, even when pop or dance or hip hop at times topped the music charts. And I've talked about that before in my album series, etc. How a lot of us think of rock as that dominant cultural music force, but it has rarely been the top seller, the top on the charts, any of that. But it was always considered, if you want to talk about artistry, you think about rock. No. The 2010s were the decade when hip hop fully became mainstream America's most influential genre and ended up influencing all other kinds of music it had done before. But to this point, forget it. This is where the conversation started shifting. That's why you have, Kendrick winning the Pulitzer and things like that. Even artists who were not in the hip hop world increasingly borrowed the aesthetics, the rhythms, the production, something that kind of, it's, of course, we've seen that happen as far back as Blondie in the very early 80s. And to a degree, Run DMC and Walk This Way and the things. And then in the 90s, there was some crossover. In the 2000s, you had people like Gwen Stefani and, other, pop people taking on some of the hip hop aesthetics. But in the 2010s, everybody. 3, trap took over everything. It was the most influential sound of the decade. It was more influential than EDM, even though that was an early contender in the decade. By the late 2010s, pop was using trap drums, R&B, and Latin music, and even country occasionally using trap drums. Number 4, though, and this, I kind of said this, EDM went mainstream and then receded. It was tumultuous because I, of course, had been aware of EDM in that form since at least the late 80s, let's say. And I saw it rise, and I saw the rise of DJs as persona, they had their own... People knew their names, basically, and how that started to rise to a degree in the 2000s, although it wasn't quite dominant. But by the end of the 2000s and into the 2010s, EDM was huge. A lot of the pop songs were EDM. I have songs running through my head. I unfortunately, somebody called 911, and all that stuff. Early 2010s were tops for that, and it was exciting because it really did merge kind of the pop structural aesthetic with the EDM, which is a great sweet spot because you've got the structural development of a song with that pounding kind of and often quite intricately produced EDM mixed together. Geez, great. But it didn't last very long, and what happened, of course, was streaming. And as streaming came along and people were more interested in very, slowly and then very quickly wanting the music to be more kind of mood music, background music, things like that, EDM really dropped, songs that had that, speaking of drop, the build, doom, 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 boom. That didn't happen anymore. A lot of the dynamics, the dynamic range of songs went from I'm going as wide as my screen here to as wide as my microphone. That's how much the range diminished by the end of the decade. And again, that's why I named the episode From a Bangarang to a Whimper. Number 5, the death of genre boundaries. The phrase "genre doesn't matter anymore" became kind of cliche because a lot of artists started using it in public. And I started doing music is not a genre pre-podcast in 2016. So it's been 10 years since I've been using that moniker. And it's because in the middle of that decade, I saw it happening. It was something I'd felt my whole life and decided to finally call it out, to say it out loud. And a lot of artists were doing that. And in this decade, artists were increasingly blending styles. You had Post Malone doing rap and rock and pop, and The Weeknd doing R&B and pop and electronic, and Lil Nas X doing country and rap and pop. And streaming rewarded this. Because again, or if it was YouTube, because you could find anything you want. And people were like, oh no, I actually like that better than, the more genre rigid music. And those stream, yeah. And so there were multiple artist releases that defied genre. And that was actually its own movement for a while that did bleed into the 2020s. That's still happening. It's receded somewhat, but it's good to see that it's still out there because you want more and more of that. And honestly, where it is the strongest to me is in younger artists in their 20s and hip hop. Now it's elsewhere too. But as you'll see in a few weeks, I'm going to do another quick takes, and I'm going to go through many albums from this year. And I talk about how so many of the albums are produced soup to nuts from top to bottom, very much the same, which is a trend that I had hoped, would have died out years ago, but it seems to be back. But that's not what this is. This is people kind of really expanding their genre. And again, of course, the bonus MxTRA at patreon.com/music is not a genre. It's the death of genre bias. You'll get to learn way more than I just said about that. And yeah, support the show for as little as $1 a month there. 6, the rise of mood music. One of the least discussed things outside of this podcast, but it was a huge shift. In earlier decades, listeners chose music by genre in particular. Oh, I like emo. I'm gonna do emo. I like alt hip hop. I'm gonna do alt hip hop or whatever, or neo soul. In the streaming era, the listeners increasingly chose by feeling. And you had playlists like Chill and Focus and Sleep and all these things that we talked about when I talked about Liz Pelly's book with Steve Erickson, and then the subsequent episode that I released on my take on her Spotify book. That mood, man, that has dominated. It still dominates, and I wonder if that's going to change. It hasn't changed yet, but it started in the mid-2010s. And that's what encouraged softer dynamics, atmospheric production, mid-tempo grooves, mood over virtuosity, mood over dynamic shifts. And even though to a degree, of course, in any form of music, you're going to find amazing music and great stuff. And I'm sure early on, there were things that I was super into. Like if you go as far back as kind of pre this and Gautier and somebody that I used to know, that's a great kind of example of this kind of music that it predated the real surge of it. So there were things that I definitely liked and ways in which I incorporated that into a small portion of my music. But I'm much more of a fan of music that explores dynamic ranges and sonic ranges. Number 7, Latin music became truly global. Latin music had crossed over before several times from at least the 40s onward. And then usually at some point in every decade, Latin music crosses over. But never at this scale and never just so fully Spanish, meaning that a lot of the songs that were popular were sung in Spanish. Some were Spanish and English, but you had, of course, J Balvin and Bad Bunny and people like that. Non-English language hits were now proven that they could dominate world charts. You didn't need to understand what people were singing if you liked the music, and that's gotten more dominant with things like K-pop. In fact, at number 8, K-pop became a global force. The seeds existed earlier. You think of Rain and people like that in the 2000s, but the 2010s were when K-pop stopped being primarily regional. BTS surged, one of the biggest acts on earth. The decade ended with K-pop kind of functioning as a genuine pillar of global pop culture, not just a niche import. Of course, I talked about the entire history of K-pop and South Korean music in an episode a couple of weeks ago, so check that out. Number 9, the album lost power relative to the playlist. Albums still matter artistically. They always will, I believe. But culturally, not as many people, listener-wise, were talking about albums. Playlists were becoming more important, certainly for, statistics, for the analytics. Individual tracks were more important. Now, I talked about this in my album series and in a couple of others where there have been certain times in history when singles were more important than albums. Nothing wrong with that. There was a time when albums weren't important at all, and then they were hugely important, and then it went back and forth and back and forth. We're in an era now where it's a little bit of both. In the mid to late 2010s, it was singles. It was absolutely singles. And that's why it gave artists the ability to release longer albums, because nobody cared what you did with the albums. So put 20 songs on there. It's really only the singles that mattered. and people might discover something else and bring that to the fore streaming wise. But again, that's just a single song. And then artists also release more frequent singles. That's the way to hit your market, and it's what people pay attention to. Deluxe editions became a huge thing because then you just added more singles, and more like alternate takes and things like that. Or albums that either made zero artistic statement. In other words, they kind of just put a bunch of songs together because, again, the single thing, or made a huge artistic statement, which is still happening even now. We have people like Ray and certainly so many others where they're kind of telling stories through their albums because the artists want to make the albums important. That's why I did Kite to Camden. That's kind of a story album in its own way, but also because there's a part of the artists and the economics where people knew nobody was really paying as much attention to that. And as long as you had a couple of good singles on there, just like history, you would maximize your streaming. Number 10. Last one, digital gatekeepers superseded human ones. So in previous eras, you had radio programmers, music video programmers like MTV and other channels and other programs, record stores and what they decided to stock there, music magazines, hugely, even music websites. To a large degree. But by the end of the 2010s, it was algorithms. It was YouTube. It was Spotify. It was certainly social media and TikTok and stuff like that were far more gatekeepers than any of the previous kinds. They still exist and they're still to a degree gatekeeping, but not to the degree that those various forms of internet commerce and internet sharing have done. And that shift happened in the 2010s. So and that means that the music industry became far less centralized and far more reliant on algorithms and how people and companies could manipulate those algorithms. Think of Geese and Wet Leg and the controversy there, and not to take anything away from the artists, whether you like them or not. It's how things are promoted, and all of a sudden, why is it that all of the critics find this one artist that nobody knew to be the, one of the top 10 artists of the year? They're as prone to being victims of hype as we are. There was money behind their promotion. That's it for tech and music changes. We're going to get into great producers of the 2010s. So some reminders. I will miss some. So tell me who I should have included. I will mention a handful I've mentioned before, as I said, because they are that influential. They fit more than one decade. I will cover most major genres. Keep in mind, as always, that many of these producers genre hop, especially in this decade. So whatever category I put them in, you can take with a grain of salt. Also, you will notice a jump in how many producers I name. I named 27 different producers, which, coincidentally, was it last week? I had 27 examples of chart hits and streaming hits. Compared to the 2000s and 1990s, that's quite a bit more. The internet and streaming brought this about, as did the decreased reliance on genre rules and on the industry being centralized. And again, bonus MxTRA, patreon.com/music is not a genre, the death of genre bias. We're going to jump right into these great producers, starting with pop and mainstream music. I'm going to rename a dude, Max Martin. How could you not name him in more than one decade? He was the defining hit maker, I think, of two decades, the 2000s and the 2010s. He's still going strong today, but when you think of things like Taylor Swift's 1989 from 2014, Katy Perry and Ariana Grande, and then The Weeknd's Can't Feel My Face from 2015, and his Blinding Lights from 2019, you have to say that Max Martin is arguably the most successful producer-songwriter in modern pop history. For sure deserved a second mention here. Next one, Jack Antonoff. If you've heard me mention him before, you may know how I feel about him, and that may come up later in the episode. That's all I'm saying. Jack helped define late 2010s indie pop and singer-songwriter pop with that chill kind of one feel, one sound through the whole song music. Key collaborator for Taylor Swift, Lorde, St. Vincent, Lana Del Rey. Specific releases like Lorde's Mellow Drama from 2017, Norman fucking Rockwell from 2019, Lana Del Rey, and Taylor Swift's Reputation from 2017. Another pop producer, Greg Kurstin, who has worked with Adele, Sia, Beck, Foo Fighters, including Adele's Hello from 2015 and 25, the album 25. Colors, Beck's 2014 album, which is it's really an unsung Beck album. You got to go back and listen to that. I think you'll love it. He was a master and is a master of sophisticated musician-driven pop production, allowing the musician's personality to shine through very specific production choices. Benny Blanco, behind dozens of major hits such as Maroon 5's Moves Like Jagger from 2011, Teenage Dream era hits, the Katy Perry, 2010 to 2012, Justin Bieber's Love Yourself in 2015, blend pop and hip-hop and electronic influences into something that knocks back mainstream radio. Electronic and dance is the next genre here we're going through. And again, these people all cross genres, but number one, David Guetta. His late 2000s, early 2010s run helped create the entire EDM pop boom that we talked about earlier. When you think of the songs, I Got a Feeling, Sexy Bitch, When Love Takes Over, Titanium, I love that song, Without You, Turn Me On. Those are huge, and you got to give David Guetta credit for, again, helping to create and usher in the EDM boom. I will say that I won't certainly credit him for the demise of the EDM boom, but I will say he did play somewhat of a part, and then I'll explain that in the conclusions. Skrillex, dubstep's biggest crossover figure. He was huge in the early 2010s. He helped reshape mainstream pop production. So many people use the aesthetics that he brought to the fore. To this day, you still hear them. Dominated radio and EDM simultaneously. His Scary Monsters and Nice Sprites influence continued into the 2010s. Of course, the title of this episode, Bangarang from 2011. Where Are You Now from 2015 with Diplo and Justin Bieber. Huge. Even though he may not have worked with as many artists as some of these producers, his influence is gigantic. Pharrell Williams from the Neptunes. As a solo artist in half of the Neptunes, Pharrell was a massive cultural architect in the 2000s and retained his status as a hitmaker in the 2010s. With global smashes like Daft Punk's Get Lucky, which I think it was 2013, Robin Thicke's Blurred Lines, say about it what you will. He helped merge retro funk and R&B with modern pop, cementing his timeless influence. And speaking, and when you think about what he does, it's very minimalist, even in the Neptunes, but minimalist in a way that's still driving and that still has dynamic range. Production note here, Calvin Harris is someone else who should be mentioned in this EDM boom. Unfortunately, that song, the 1980s, and his kind of brand of more, British aesthetic, but still EDM mixed with pop is something that was huge again in the first half of the 2010s for sure, and probably the late 2000s as well. I forgot to place a lot of notes for him, or any notes at all on my notes, but I believe he deserved a mention. So Calvin Harris. Another one, Flume, one of the decade's most influential sound designers, countless future bass imitators. Future bass is something that mixes dubstep and EDM trap with warmer rhythms. So it has that kind of atmospheric feel, but it still has the punch of dubstep and EDM. Some of his productions, Flume from 2012, Skin from 2016, Never Be Like You from 2016. Again, not someone who worked a lot with other artists, but someone whose sound influenced a lot of people. Again, same thing, Disclosure, another producer, revitalized house music for mainstream audiences. You have his releases Settle from 2013, Latch, the song from 2012, and Omen from 2015. And then someone you may know, Diplo, huge name in EDM. A major laser pop crossover work, dance hall pop influence. Major Lazer, somebody that he worked with in 2015's Peace is the Mission. And then Lean On, 2015. And then again, that Skrillex song, Where Are You Now, 2015. And Diplo is a name that still gets knocked around. A lot of collaborations with Diplo. Skrillex, I think, is for some reason more popular, not just, of course, in the EDM world, but overseas. Diplo is someone who's still mentioned quite often. We're going to do I would say just a little bit more here. Let's do experimental avant pop. So you have Sophie, one of the most influential producers of the decade, artistically speaking, helped create the sonic vocabulary of hyperpop, something I've been talking about. I found out in reviewing my episodes for at least 5 years now, but it had been around, like I'm saying here, since at least the 2010s. Think of things like BIP from 2013, Oil of Every Pearl's Uninsides from 2018. Is that not an artistic name? And Vroom Vroom from 2016 by Charlie XCX. Sophie helped to influence where hyperpop would go, and hyperpop has influenced a lot of pop since then. Arca, radical electronic production influencing pop, rap, and experimental music, including contributions to Yeezus in 2013, the own album Arca in 2017, and Mutant from 2015. And then finally, before we take a break here, A.G. Cook, founder of the PC music movement, look it up, and a major force behind hyperpop yet again. I mean, hyperpop is something that we have to continue to take into account, even though it's morphing. Its influence has not stopped. PC Music launched in 2013 was huge. Number one Angel in 2017 with Charlie XCX. Also with Charlie XCX, Pop 2, same year. And that's a good place to take a break. We'll get to more great producers in other genres and conclusions and all the rest after the mid-roll. See you in a minute. Hey, MxG fans, thank you as always for watching and listening. Listeners, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre. You get a video for every episode of this podcast. Watchers, go to nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre if you would rather just listen. And everyone, please take some time out to go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre to support this podcast, my band rec, and everything I do for as little as $1 a month. Speaking of everything I do, nickdimatteo.com really does have it all. If you're interested in unique and quirky t-shirts that I've all personally hand designed, go to nickdimatteo.com/shop and you can find it all there, including discounts if you sign up for my newsletter or Patreon. If you're someone who's always wanted to write a song, has just never figured out how to get there, let me work with you. I am the Song Coach. Go to nickdimatteo.com/thesongcoach, and whether you're a complete beginner or completely advanced, I can get you there. You can book a free 30-minute call right there on the site. And of course, I am always releasing new music. Go to nickdimatteo.com/music to find it all. My complete discography is there. All of the social links are there. And of course, please like, share, subscribe, rate, review. Do it for the podcast. Do it for the music. Sharing is especially valuable to all of us indie creators. I really appreciate your support, your eyes and ears. Thank you for hanging with me for this mid-roll, and let's get back to the show. All right, we are back. Let's get right into the great producers, diving into alternative and indie. And you have Danger Mouse. I did mention him before. He's a rare producer, equally respected in indie, rock, hip-hop, and pop. That's why he deserves another mention, even if so much of his work was kind of more stealth in the 2010s. He worked with the Black Keys, Norah Jones, Chili Peppers, the Black Keys' El Camino in 2011 and Turned Blue in 2014. And he worked Karen O's solo album Lux Prima 2019. That's just a small sample. The way Danger Mouse has produced over the last 25 years has been a huge influence on where music has gone and began to infiltrate pop and mainstream in the 2010s. Probably earlier. Well, actually, definitely earlier with songs like Crazy and stuff like that. James Ford worked with Arctic Monkeys, Foals, Depeche Mode, Florence and the Machine. Notable releases, Arctic Monkeys AM 2013, and Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino in 2018, and Foals' Everything Not Saved Will Be Lost. I remember really enjoying Foals back around that time. And that's a certain aesthetic. Depeche Mode is one of my favorite bands. Not all of their releases are my favorites, but I appreciate everything they do. I would say that James Ford is not necessarily somebody I jibe with in terms of production, but I respect. John Congleton, the indie rock producer. I got to look up more information on this guy because the things he's done and the way he produces are like, if I could hook up with him for Rek's next album, I would absolutely do it. Worked with St. Vincent on 2017's Mass Seduction and Remind Me Tomorrow, 2019 by Sharon Van Etten, and so many others. Then you have a production, well, let's say person at this point called The Drop. If you know that name, it's because it's one of my, it's my production name and one of my artist names. And in the 2010s, The Drop, meaning me, produced Rek's EP Distance to Empty in 2013 and Rek's album The Sunshine Seminar in 2015. The Drop's work, I'm going to speak third person because I think this is something that's deserving of being up here with the others, but also it'd be kind of weird if I just kept saying I. The Drop's work anticipated one of the defining themes of 2010's music production, which is the erosion of genre loyalty and the rise of a more eclectic, song-centric philosophy. Long before genre fluid became a common industry term, the production approach on Distance to Empty and the Sunshine Seminar treated genres as resources rather than destinations. A song could begin with the framework of power pop, then incorporate electronic production, have alternative rock textures, and still maintain a strong emphasis on melody and songwriting. And this would continue to influence later Rek releases like The Weird Objective and Kite to Camden, which is perhaps the culminating statement of this approach. Parts and Labor largely occupied an alternative rock space rooted in guitars, traditional song structures, band-oriented power pop arrangements from 2007. The Rek's releases in the 2010s expanded the sonic palette to include all of the things that I mentioned before. Parts and Labor was band first. Distance to Empty was song first, whatever served the song. And Sunshine Seminar was possibility first. What could I add to the textures of the songs to create a signature Rek sound, regardless of genre, and kind of create Rek's own genre? And that was really when all of the things that had been happening prior to that congealed in the Sunshine Seminar. It's why it's one of Rek's most revered albums. Of course, more on this in the featured song. Next, R&B and alternative R&B. Frank Dukes, one of the most influential behind-the-scenes figures of the decade. Worked with Drake, One Dance 2016 as an example. Post Malone, Congratulations 2017. Camila Cabello, Havana in 2017. Talk about being huge. Also worked with The Weeknd. Illangelo, essential architect of The Weeknd's dark atmospheric sound. House of Balloons 2011. Trilogy 2012. Beauty Behind the Madness 2015. Then you have one called 1985 with the 19 as a word and 85 as a number. Key contributor to Drake's mid-2010 sound, such as Hotline Bling from 2015, Hold On We're Going Home from 2013, and certain highlights from Views 2016. Hip-hop. There will be more producers here because, as we mentioned, hip-hop was so dominant in the 2010s and, of course, continues to be so, although many people say it's going through a crisis right now. A lot of what's coming out of hip-hop, I'm enjoying. And maybe it's because I like those experimental kind of exploratory crisis periods. I don't know. Mustard, his minimalist West Coast club sound became one of the defining sounds of early to mid-2010s hip-hop and pop radio. Tyga's Rock City from 2011. Kid Ink's Show Me from 2013. And Rihanna's Needed Me from 2016. And of course, he surged back into the consciousness with working with Kendrick. Kanye, again, mentioned him before. Have to mention him again when you have releases like My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, Yeezus, and The Life of Pablo. He is certainly a producer-first artist and doesn't work a lot with other people, but his sonic influence is still enormous in the 2010s. And honestly, going through his issues, but even in the 2020s, people still talk about him. That's 3 different decades. Metro Boomin, the architect of modern trap, Future, 21 Savage, Travis Scott, Migos. He did Jumpman, Drake and Future in 2015, and Mask Off with Future in 2017, and Not All Heroes Wear Capes in 2018. Mike Will Made It What a great name. One of the most important trap producers of the early to mid 2010s. Bands, Make Her Dance, 2010 from Juicy J. We Can't Stop, 2013 from Miley Cyrus. You see that crossover. And Black Beatles in 2016 from Ray Shremmerd. You got to look them up. Which, by the way, Ray Shremmerd is backwards for drummer's ear. No ID, work with Common. Jay-Z, including 444 and the story of OJ from 2017, is a mentor to Kanye in many ways and a major force behind early Kendrick and J. Cole projects. Also, Vince Staples, 2015, Summertime '06, and J-Rock's Redemption from 2018. Louis Bell, synonymous with late 2010s, Bell's sleek genre-blending pop and trap production became the definitive sound of the streaming era. Produced all 5 of Post Malone's massive solo number ones from the decade, including Rockstar and Circles, alongside Halsey's Without Me. And one more in hip-hop, Hit Boy. Consistent hitmaker whose influence grew throughout the decade. N-Words in Paris 2011 from Jay-Z and Kanye West. Click 2012. And King's Disease, Groundwork, anyway, in late 2010s collaborations with Nas. That's big. Going to the next genre, rock, Americana, and roots. You have Dave Cobb, the defining roots rock and Americana producer of the decade. Chris Stapleton's Traveler in 2015. Jason Isbell's Something More Than Free in 2015. By the way, I Forgive You, 2018, Brandi Carlile. These are huge. They were certainly huge then, but nothing compared to where this music has gone in the last 10 years. And you can thank Dave Cobb to a large degree for that. Rick Rubin, I think this may be the 3rd or 4th time I have mentioned him. I think the 4th time. Not as commercially dominant in this decade as other previous, but still responsible for major records across genres. I again, don't love everything he does, but the stuff I do love, I really love, and he has to be considered one of the enduring giant producers ever in the history of music. 2011's The King is Dead by the Decemberists. Black Sabbath's 13 in 2013 and Eminem's Revival in 2017 are just some samples of what he did in the 2010s. And those are the great producers of the 2010s. You tell me what you think about that. I don't know. I will ask you that later. Let's get to conclusions. What's interesting about the 2010s is that it may be the first decade where producers like Jack Antonoff, Metro Boomin, Sophie, and Skrillex became also almost as culturally recognizable as the artists they worked with. Something that previously happened mainly with figures like Phil Spector, Quincy Jones, Brian Eno. So there are always times, history is a cycle and things ebb and flow. There are times when the producer's more of the behind the scenes person, you don't really know their name, etc. And then there are times where they pop to the fore and you're like, everybody knows George Martin and, again, Phil Spector, Quincy Jones for sure, Brian Eno, Max Martin, and then now Jack Antonoff, Metro, like people like that. You're saying their names the way you say artists' names. They were more like collaborators than traditional producers in the 2010s and even before, and even now, certainly now. And I think, and I'm going to say this because I've seen it happen with artists, there's an over-reliance on producers to dictate artistic direction for artists. If there's a takeaway from the 2010s, from this episode, and from a lot of what I do, it's that. If you're an artist and you don't have a vision, you want to pair with a producer who can help you find that vision, sure. But at a certain point, you have to know enough of what you want to do and who you are and what sound you want to create and the kind of music you want to write that you're not so over-reliant on producers that you end up doing your version of the same thing some other artists did with that same producer. I'm not going to name names yet. And certainly not artists. I'm not going to blame artists here at all, except for if you are handing over the reins to producers. I think a lot of these producers who come off as collaborative are kind of creating avatars for their own work. And unless you are an artist with a dominant personality and a dynamic sound, you will be subsumed into their personality, and it's happened all too often, certainly in the 2010s and beyond. So I mean before to a degree, but it really became a thing in the 2010s because they would guide creative direction, the overall sound, an artist's identity, and co-write many of the songs. Not that that didn't happen in the past, but there were ways it happened in which, you know, again, there were certainly producers even in the 70s, let's say, who everything they did with whatever artist sounded kind of the same. And that's fine. Every producer has a signature sound to a degree. But if that's your ambition, especially as a producer, to be like, I'm just going to change the blink blonk keyboard sound that I use, you know, for Olivia Rodrigo, and do something slightly different for Sabrina Carpenter. Again, I actually like both of those artists quite a bit. But, and I wouldn't even say they're the best examples, but there are producers who that's all they do. They kind of just a little tweak and that's it. That to me is not very artistically ambitious or very interesting, Frank. But all of this coincided with listeners having access to the most music ever for cheap or free and less being told what they should listen to. So tastes weren't dictated, meaning fans were more open to crossovers and amalgamations. Bonus MxTRA, patreon.com/music is not a genre. The death of genre bias is largely due to this. It was allowing people's personalities to come out in a way that hadn't before because we were so beholden to whatever radio programmers said we should listen to, or critics, or the industry itself, as opposed to being able to choose for ourselves. As listeners became more eclectic, producers gained greater freedom to experiment. Audiences were increasingly comfortable hearing multiple genres within a single song, album, or artist's catalog. Many of the decade's most influential producers succeeded not by perfecting a single genre, but by blending multiple genres, which is this is my favorite thing to do. Max Martin fused pop, EDM, and hip-hop. Jack Antonoff combined indie, rock, synth-pop, singer-songwriter traditions, mellowness. Metro Boomin's trap innovations spread far beyond rap and into pop and rock and other types of music and country. Sophie Ark and A.G. Cook challenged the very notion of genre categories, that experimental side of things. Another point here is trap became the decade's most influential production language, affecting pop, R&B, Latin music, electronic music, and even country, and was also in its own way responsible for the I don't want to diminishing, I'm saying not necessarily in a derogatory way, but the diminishing of power in music, how early in the decade, boom, 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 bangarang, and things got mellower later in the decade. Trap was a part of that. Electronic production techniques became nearly universal, regardless of genre. If you're talking about analog stuff, it's because you want to be retro. I don't know of many, if any, new artists who care enough about that, which I'm fine with. Use what you want to make the music you want to make, but don't make a point of, oh, this is the technology I use, so it makes the music more special. It doesn't. It makes your story, interesting, at least to you and to other audiophiles, but it doesn't make the music more interesting. By the end of the decade, the distinction between electronic music and other forms of popular music had become increasingly blurred, something people my age, older, younger, a lot of people, even millennials, can't abide. A lot of them have a hard time understanding that there is not as much of a distinction between rock and electronic as there used to be, if there ever was, and certainly since the 80s, and that we kind of need to stop, giving an us and them read on everything. It's like my episode on rockism versus poptimism. It's important to restate that the decade really did slide from energetic EDM and rock to mellow mood, atmospheric playlist music, something that is still hanging on. Favorite producers of the 2010s. This is a fun part, as always. My favorite producers of the 2010s, and perhaps in a first, I'm going to mention my least favorite producers. Sticking with broad genre categories, in pop, I got to give it to Max Martin. I may not be into everything he does, but his dominance and mastery can't be denied. And when I like a song he's done, it's like tops pop-wise. Electro and dance, Skrillex. I mean, come on. Skrillex woke me up to the new world of EDM, really. Bangarang is still a favorite, and I just like his aesthetic, his sense of drama, the way he produces. An experimental avant pop, I don't know much about it. I've listened to some hyper pop and things like that. But considering that limitation, I'm going to give it to A.G. Cook, who seems to be able to mix the dark side with the hyper side better than the others that I mentioned. Kind of a midway between Sophie and Arca. I think Arca's darkness, ooh, and Sophie's hyper pop is quintessential. A.G. Cook kind of splits the difference, and I like that. Alt indie rock, John Congleton. Never frickin' heard of the guy. But it turns out I love his sound. Love his sound, want to work with him. And of course, in alt and indie rock, I got to give it to The Drop because I believe in the work I do, and I believe that the developments that have happened, especially in the last 15 years, have been notable. And again, featured song, we'll talk about that. R&B and alt, again, not as familiar specifically with these producers, but I'm going to go with Frank Dukes because his production is thick and dark, yet popping and moving. What a great combination. Hip-hop, the minimalist and somewhat mysterious approach of Mustard always intrigues me. Always. For rock and roots, not a huge fan of this music. I respect it, of course. But I just got to give it to Rick Rubin because he consistently stays in the game. He knows how to work with artists, whether or not you love the output all the time. Which brings me to something, again, I haven't really done. Least favorite producers. Runner-up here, with a caveat, is David Guetta. I appreciate what he does. I understand it. I really want to like what he does. But it always seems to just fall this much short of a climax to me. It's like he's leading to something that you want to just knock the shit out of you. And it doesn't quite get there. It's sort of like his version of EDM is an underwater version, which aesthetically can be amazing, can be very pleasing. That kind of mix and that sonic palette, it's not for me. I want something to hit. If I want mood music and atmospheric music, that's a whole different thing. I like some atmosphere in my EDM, but I want it to hit. And I always feel like his ambles along very, very effectively and doesn't quite hit the way I want it to. But that is nothing compared to my all-time least favorite producer currently, and that is Jack Antonoff. I just find 90% of what he does bland. He turns the word subtlety into a freaking insult as far as I'm concerned, because I appreciate subtlety. But when you are so subtle as to really not almost deliberately not commanding attention, that's disturbing to me. He finds a way to suck the personality and uniqueness out of artists and make them just an extension of his own insular outlook. There have been plenty of producers whose work I've come to appreciate because they work with artists I like. I've said that about Rick Rubin. I don't love everything he does, but when he works with an artist I like, I really love it. There are certainly other artists where I feel very, very similar in that, not artists, producers, where I feel similar in that regard in terms of being able to appreciate, oh, I get what they're doing because, this song, this artist, this album. I keep trying with Antonoff, and I got to tell you, other than the Stray single, I just can't. I can't. One final note here in the conclusions. This is the first decade in which it became truly viable for bedroom artists to create entire works from home and have them hit big. They'd done it before, but it's the first time, but they were mostly, indie, not quite pop, not mainstream. Every now and then something like that might hit, but the 2010s is where so much of that hit and continues to hit to this day, right alongside multi-million-dollar productions. Speaking of artists creating from home, the featured song. While the 2000s was when I fleshed out my producing chops and really took over that role for my music, the 2010s is when all of it got solidified and I was producing solo by the middle of the 2010s and have not looked back. I started to more fully understand my must-haves. I even made lists. I remember before I produced Distance to Empty, I said to myself, I need to have this, this, and this in here as a contrast to things I had done before and ways I wanted to expand my palette. I started to understand the rules I didn't need to follow. Oh, this is supposed to be a rock song, so it can only have X or Y. No, if I heard something and it worked, I put it in. And how my influences could be more effectively integrated and amalgamated, which had historically been the toughest thing for me. And I sort of re-explored that in the Weird Objective, where I was deliberately staying in a lane. Again, this is this type of music. It needs to stay in that lane. But I started to understand by the Sunshine Seminar, of course, especially, that you could put, something into a song that didn't quote unquote belong in that genre and it would work. And that's how Rex sound really came about. And that's why Rex 2 major releases in the 2010s could be considered the dawning of the true Rex sound. The mix of indie rock, techno, power pop, funk, and hip hop that was only hinted at in the 2000s and before then. And my featured song pick reflects that. It's from the Sunshine Seminar from 2015 and is currently the most played track from that album. It's called Different People. It combines alt pop, electro, glitch, trap, and rock. Again, amalgam. I wrote it after a difficult breakup in which I thought the woman misrepresented herself. It was not true. I was just reading the wrong signals and I was in the wrong place, myself. But it has some biting, bitter lyrics, but it's also about acknowledging that we are indeed different people and doing the best to bounce back from that. And there's no question it embodies both a moment in mid-2010s music and in Rex's career. That's why I'm choosing it. I would love for you. And there were things I did in that song that I hadn't really done prior that I still do to this day. So it was a pretty seminal song. It's Different People from the Sunshine Seminar. As always, you can stream it at nickdimatteo.com/music. And stay tuned. In a minute or less, you can hear it. Questions. Are you into 2010s music? What were some of your favorite albums and artists and songs from the 2010s? Do you remember how the energy of music in general shifted from EDM and pop rock to lo-fi and mellow mood music by the end of the decade? I would love to know your answers to these and all other questions because, as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for hanging with me for this episode. And, we're coming up pretty fast to the end of this season. Well, I don't know, 6 weeks or so to go, maybe. Either way, I will talk to you next week.
I've been living on the ghost of nothing since the day I died. Now I'm making it alive again, 'cause I won't be denied. You were bright like the sun, so I thought that you would warm my soul. But your scared ass collapsed and I fell into your big black hole. I tried to work it up. Now, we're different people. Now,
people. Different people. Different people.